think we learn as we read through the Scriptures is that you never know who God is going to use. Right? There's a song that I like by Rich Mullins. You may be familiar with him. He sings a couple of the songs in our books by him. Awesome God, Step by Step. But he sings a song, and it goes through, and he goes, you never know who God's going to use. And he talks about Balaam and the donkey. He's like, you never know who God's going to use. Maybe the donkey's going to open his mouth and talk to you. And so, inevitably, who knows? Who knows when God is going to work, or more importantly, who He's going to end up working through, right? Or how He's going to end up working through us. Because inevitably, we should know one thing. While we may not know who God's going to work through in our lives, we should know that God is going to work through us in some way. And He is going to use us in some way. So maybe the question shouldn't be, who's God going to use, but how is He going to use us, right? We do know one thing for sure. Right? God is going to use us, and accomplish His will through us as willing and seeking vessels. I think we more commonly end up referring to this as calling. Instead of saying God's going to use us, we say God has a calling for us, right? God has a calling on each and every one of our lives. There's a unique, very specific calling to each of us that cannot be duplicated or fulfilled by somebody else. Mary cannot fulfill my calling, and I cannot fulfill Mary's calling, right? Although at the same time, there is some crossover. There are a lot of things that Mary and I are going to both do and both be called to. I think that is the reason why we find the world in the suffering state that it tends to be in. Because God has a call on absolutely everyone. He has a plan for absolutely everyone. Both those who know themselves to be His children and those who refuse to see themselves as His children, right? But not everyone responds to that call. That calling goes unfulfilled, or rather filled in a way that may be lacking from its original purpose. I think it's kind of like the experience of a substitute teacher. They come in for a couple days or a week, and they might do a great job. They may be the best teacher there is, but a substitute can never live up to the responsibilities of another teacher's class. And on top of that, what generally happens when a substitute teacher walks into the room? Chaos, yeah. That's putting it politely, right? Because the kids know, hey, they're not going to be here tomorrow. They can't punish me, right? Yeah. Who cares what they think? Who cares what they say? There's something lacking. It's not really their class. All of us have some kind of calling, whether it be in teaching, whether it be in carpentry, real estate, nursing, whatever. I know in my case that I've been called to teach and preach, and eventually to long-term missions work. I think ultimately, even though this might seem like I have a pretty clear idea of what I've been called to, I think ultimately when I look at it, I go, I don't have a clue. Because that's really big. Okay? Where am I supposed to preach? What am I supposed to preach about? How am I supposed to do it? How long? How short? What words? What verses? What way? To what people? That doesn't narrow it down at all. And I think this is often true for most of us. I think most of us have a general sense. Okay, Brenda, for example, I know you love your work, right? And I think you've got a very clear sense of calling that this is what you're supposed to do. But then sometimes it's like, okay, well, should I do it in this setting? Should I do it in that setting? Should I do it with these people? Should I do it with those people? And so on and so forth. Well, what do you... Okay? Having a general sense of calling sometimes doesn't seem to help that much. We generally have no sense... Well, we generally don't have too many specifics. What are we called to do once we get there? What is our purpose? What are we supposed to accomplish? I think that no matter how clear a sense of calling that we have, there is always a greater sense of mystery than there is of clarity. Okay, God, but what do I do when I get there? Sometimes we don't even know where there is. So I will do whatever I'm called to do when I figure out what it is, and if I can ever figure out what it is, and where it is, and how it is, and so on and so forth. I mean, how are we to accomplish the what if we can't even get a sense of where and when to get started at it? I think the most difficult part of calling in being used by God is the lack of clarity we're given. Let's give an example here. Who knows exactly what to do in somebody's mourning? How do you comfort them? Does anybody really know? Right? You know you're supposed to comfort. You know you're supposed to mourn with them. You know you're supposed to be there with them. But inevitably when you show up and you're sitting there next to them, you're going, oh, what am I supposed to say? What am I supposed to do? Should I say anything at all? We have no clue. It's one of the most uncomfortable feelings there is. Funerals can be one of the most uncomfortable places. Because you want to be of help. You want to fulfill that calling that you know you have, but you don't know how to do it. Now, while there are many unclear, blurry, and unpredictable aspects of calling, and I'm not going to attempt to answer those blurry, unclear, unpredictable aspects, because I think that's unique to each of us. And it's the relationship that determines that. And it's stepping out and making mistakes that teaches us what those specifics are. But I do think as we look at our lives and look at our callings, we do know there are some very definite, specific things that we can say without a doubt we are called to. If you've experienced the love of God and received the salvation of Christ, raise your hand. But if you have, right, then we can know without a doubt that we have been called to share what we have. We've been called to evangelize. That's pretty clear. That's pretty specific. We may not know a lot of things, but we know that. You may have no idea what to do with your life. Suffering from mass confusion and a jumbled path of unclear directions. But you can know with confidence, no matter where your life might take you, that you are definitely called to share what you've been given in that place, wherever life might take you. There is one thing we can confidently grab hold of and know 100% without a doubt that we are to do. We are called to share the good news. We are called to share the love of God with His world and His saving grace. Turn over to Luke chapter 24. Luke chapter 24. It's the last chapter of the Gospel of Luke. We're going to read starting in verse 44. Luke chapter 24. It will also be up behind me. Then he said to them, "These are the words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures. And he said to them, "Thus it is written, that the Christ should suffer and on the third day arise from the dead, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins should be proclaimed in His name to all the nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things." I think we need to, maybe that's the verse we need to hold on to over and over. You are witnesses of these things. "And behold, I am sending the promise of my Father upon you. But stay in the city until you are clothed with power from on high." Jesus rises from the dead. He comes back to His disciples. And you can just imagine all the questions running through their head, right? I mean, let's think about it. What kind of questions would be running through their heads right now? Well, I imagine it'd be much like a funeral. What am I supposed to say? What am I supposed to do? Is this appropriate? Is this inappropriate? Should I say anything at all? I mean, this is the Son of God, and He just rose from the dead, and He just is standing here talking with you. What are you supposed to do? But one of their questions had to be deep down, what was the point in all of this? First of all, this is the Son of God, right? He is all powerful. He can do anything He could ever desire. Why is He sending us? Why does He need us? Why did we spend the last few years of our lives following Him around and listening to His great words and seeing His amazing works if He was simply going to leave? What was the point? Granted, we're blessed and we experience great things. Our life is fulfilled because of all we have seen. But why did we see and why did we experience the things that we saw? Why me? On top of that, why did God send His Son down here to die? Couldn't He have done something from there? Well, the answer to that is, of course. God didn't need the disciples. He didn't need to display His love for us in His death. There are a million other scenarios that would have accomplished the same end, so why did God bother with lowly disciples and death on a cross? Well, this is what Jesus was coming to answer. He came to give them their calling, to give them answer to the why, and to show them the purpose of all their sacrifices and all the time that they spent with Him, to tell them why He died. All the words He spoke to them, all the great works He accomplished among them, every one of them had a purpose. If Jesus was sent here simply to save us, then He could have just appeared, died, and left. But that's not what He chose to do. Jesus chose to spend time teaching, preaching, and most important of all, loving. Christ called the disciples and lived His life for the purpose of displaying the great love of God. Now He turns to the disciples and He reminds them of what He said. And then He opens their eyes and says, this is why. Suddenly they get it. All of creation has led up to this point. Everything since the beginning of the Garden of Eden was for this purpose. Everything has pointed to the love and salvation of God. But that still doesn't quite explain the why to them. God came for the purpose of saving all of humanity, not just the Jews, not just a few disciples. Would you be content as a parent if God told you that 2 out of the 3 of your children would love you? No, we've asked this before. Of course not. And neither is God. God's love is so great that He cannot bear to even see one of His children fall. It hurts Him so greatly. And so Jesus says to His disciples that repentance and forgiveness of sins must be proclaimed. God's children must know that He loves them and wants them. This is why the disciples have gone through all that they have. This is why they spent so many years at His side, following, listening, seeing, experiencing. Jesus says, they are the witnesses. They have experienced the depth of love that the Father has for us. They have seen the sincerity, and they understand His Word and His salvation. Do you remember back in Matthew 4 when Jesus called the disciples? Matthew 4:18-20 reads, while walking by the Sea of Galilee, He saw 2 brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And He said to them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Immediately they left their nets and followed Him. Jesus comes by and He says, hey you! Follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. They don't even know what that means. Walk up to somebody on the street and say, hey, I'll make you a fisher of men. What? But they drop everything for that purpose. Jesus says, I'm going to teach you how to reel in the children of God to what they were always meant for, to the love of God. You will bring them to their salvation. And now today is the day of graduation. They left everything to become fishers of men. Well, now they have become fishers of men. This is what they were called to, and now Jesus says, this is the moment. Congratulations. Here is your diploma. You're all fishers of men. You are witnesses. They have done it, and now they must start fishing. Get out there and tell the world of all you have learned. They're not simply to reel them in, but they are to make more fishers of men, and then more, and then more, and on, and on, and on. Why doesn't God just simply say, all right, you're saved, all right, come on up here with me now? Because God loves you, but He loves His other children too. And if he just says, all right, you're good, come on up with me, then what happens to them? So the very purpose, the foundation behind every calling has to start with to be witnesses, to share, to show, to speak. This is how the great love of God will be displayed. This is how the world will experience and learn of their lover. Here, generations and generations and generations and generations later, we are the direct result of the witnesses of the very life and death of Christ. His story has been shared with us, and we're told, congratulations, you are now fishers of men. Go into the world. It doesn't end with, congratulations, you've seen the love of God. No. Go out and do the same. We've been given a great gift. Think about the disciples. They're probably thinking, who are we that we've been chosen to receive something so great? We're dirty, smelly fishermen. How are we even worthy to be disciples of Christ? Or even think about it from this regard. We're fishermen. Who's going to listen to us? I remember somebody else. Moses. Who am I that Pharaoh's going to listen to me? How am I going to get an audience with Pharaoh? Well, God made a way for that, didn't he? We've been given the unmerited and unearned grace and love of God. We are unworthy to behold and experience the very presence of God. But we don't just get to realize His love and salvation, but just like His disciples, we get to experience the very presence of His Spirit living within us. We've been turned into the temple of God, the place in which He resides and lives, where God is living within us. So then how can we bear to keep silence? How can we not shout it from the rooftop? In fact, we are commanded not to be silent. Matthew 10:27. What I tell you in the dark, say it in the light. And what you hear whispered, proclaim on the housetops. We are called to make the love and grace of God known to the world. How can we keep silent about such a great gift? I want you to turn over to the Gospel of Mark and look at the end of it. Gospel of Mark. I want to show you something. If you have the King James, it's not going to be in there. But if you look over towards the end of the Gospel of Mark, right after verse 8, it says something. Some of the earliest manuscripts do not include 16, 9 to 20. It's generally accepted that the last part there was added on later. You know how the Gospel of Mark originally ended? But go tell His disciples and Peter that He is going before you to Galilee. There you will see Him just as He told you. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. You're supposed to read that, look at that, and go, well, who's going to share it? Who's going to tell them? How are the disciples going to know? That's the point. We should have the same sense of urgency today. We shouldn't be looking at our story and going, they ran with trembling and astonishment. They left with contentment and peace, and they were full of His love, and they didn't tell anybody. We should be distressed at the thought that, why aren't they going to the disciples? We should be distressed by the thought of, why aren't we speaking to His children? It's so important. It's so valuable. It's been entrusted to us. We need to look on it with urgency. We need to look on it with even a desperateness. While there's a great gap in our knowledge of what we've been called to, there are some absolutes that we know for certain, aren't there? We have been called to evangelism and to proclaim God's love to His children. If we take on that calling, living it not to the best of our abilities, but rather beyond our abilities, relying on God's strength, the rest will fall in line and will we'll be living out the calling of God. If we know a part of our calling, right, and we choose to live that out, don't you think we're going to learn the specifics along the way? You're not going to find the trail marker as to whether you should turn right or left if you're not on the trail in the first place, right? You have to go down the road until you see the sign. We know what we are supposed to do. We may not know the specifics, but we know where to start. And we need to start there, no matter where we're at. And we will learn. We will grow. It'll be shown to us. We're not expected to just walk blindly in the darkness, but we're going to figure it out as we go along. And so we have to look at that and ask ourselves, what have we as a church been called to? What is the calling of this church congregation? I don't know. But I do know that we are called to share, proclaim the gospel. We may not know the specifics. We may have no clue where we're going. But we can start there and learn along the way. We need to be able to ask ourselves, when we ask ourselves, who are we? We need to be able to come up with the answer saying, we are the witnesses. We are the witnesses that are going out, the witnesses that are proclaiming, the witnesses that cannot keep silent, the witnesses that get to Mark 16:8 and go, it can't stop there. Notice what message Jesus said was to be conveyed. It was forgiveness and salvation, not condemnation. We need to make our lives personally be defined as fishers of men. But it cannot be our lives alone, because I am not the church, and you are not the church. But rather, we together are the church. I am not the temple of God, you are not the temple of God, but we together are the temple of God. We must learn to go out into our community together. And we must find a way to speak His love in the darkest places together. For me to preach here in this building, or to teach, for you to teach, or for us to learn, no matter what our words and worship might be, what we do in this building is not evangelism. Evangelism is bringing God's love to those who do not yet know it. And we talked about it, I don't think it was last week, maybe the week before. When you go fishing, okay, do you sit in your living room, maybe in the bathtub or whatever body of water you can find, and throw the line in there? Or do you go to where the fish are? The witness doesn't wait for the court to show up in their house. The witness goes to court, right? We go out. Outside of Sundays, outside of Wednesdays. If we are to make fishers of men, we need to learn again how to be fishers of men. We need to embark on our calling with a sincere urgency and sincerity. God's love for the world must become our love for the world. It must be like Moses, right? These aren't those people. These are my people. These aren't that person over there. That's mine. That's God's. And so we come to them and we say, what will we do as fishers of men?